few years ago, I was speaking with a professor I had in the seminary, and we were talking about another professor who has since died. So my old professor said to me, "Do you know what he used to say about you?" I said, "Well, I guess I'm going to find out." And he said, "You know that Hoye, if you give him a 5-page paper to write, that's all you're going to get is 5 pages, not a sentence more." And that was not a compliment. Basically, he was saying that I did the minimum. But in my defense, there was another professor we had who, when he assigned a 5-page paper, and if you went on to page 6 or 7, he would deduct points from your final grade. So that's the mindset that I had. The point, though, to be made is that doing the minimum is usually not a good practice in lots of areas in life, and including in the moral life. In today's continuation of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus basically says to his disciples, doing the minimum is not enough. And he cites the 5th, 6th, and 8th commandment. Your ancestors have been told this, but I say to you this. And each time it goes beyond the minimum that the commandment refers to. For example, he says, your ancestors have said to you, you should not commit adultery. But I say, whoever looks with lust on another has already committed adultery in his heart. Remember the trouble that Jimmy Carter got into? Back in 1979, he gave an interview in Playboy. Now, I never read it in its original source. But there were many references to it in the press. And Carter had said, well, I guess they must have asked him if he had ever committed adultery. And he said, well, Matthew's gospel says, he said, so I guess I have. And I have looked with lust on other women, so I guess I have committed adultery in my heart. Carter was right, but the press had a field day with him. Jesus also says in this gospel, your ancestors have been told you should not commit murder. But what I say to you is you should not even be angry with your brother or sister. Sometimes when people come to confession to me and they've been away for a long time, they say, well, I don't really know what to tell you. I say, well, what have you done wrong? And they, more than a few times, will say, well, I haven't killed anybody. And I say, well, good for you. What about the rest of that commandment? And I might cite Jesus saying it's just not the physical act of murder that we're not supposed to do, the minimum. We really are trying to control our anger or our rage or our wrath against another. Remember the actor Michael Landon? He had at least 3 successful television series. Bonanza, where he was Little Joe, and then Little House on the Prairie. Then the final one was A Highway to Heaven. And he conceived of the highway to heaven when he was driving on one of the infamous LA freeways. And it was a bad, bad day in traffic, and people were hot and yelling and cutting each other off. And Landon just said, wouldn't it be great if we could take all that energy that we use in anger and put it in acts of kindness with a sense of caring and being compassionate to the other. And that's what the last series was about. We might call it today Random Acts of Kindness. One of the shows dealt with a child cancer victim. And apparently Landon used to like to use real-life situations, people who had experienced this. And he was going to interview a young boy by the name of Josh Wood, who had already lost a leg to cancer. But what bothered Josh even more was the fact that he stammered. Today we have the Oscar-nominated film The King's Speech, about a king who stammered. Back then, for Landon, it was Josh. And Landon told Josh that the important thing was that he be a good actor. And if he stammered, he would simply be a good actor who stammered. And much to everyone's surprise, when Josh read for the part, he didn't stammer at all. In 2 years, he went into remission, and his stammer never, ever came back. And Landon always said that it was because of the fact that someone was kind to him, someone who was understanding to him, let him experience that rather than stress or anger or whatever it might be. As we hear Jesus continue his Sermon on the Mount this morning, may we hear in particular his call to his disciples to do away with anger and discontent. Let's commit ourselves to random acts of kindness. If we do, wouldn't the world be a better place?